My name is Megan Bever. I am book review editor for the Journal of the Civil War Era. And today I am with Brian Matthew Jordan and Jonathan White to talk about their book Final Resting Places, which was published by University of Georgia Press in 2023. Professor Jordan is chair of the Department of History at Sam Houston State University. He teaches courses on the Civil War and Reconstruction, American military history, and the U.S. History Survey. He is author and editor of numerous volumes, including Marching Home, Union Veterans and Their Unending Civil War. And Jonathan White is professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University. He's author or editor of 17 books that cover a variety of topics, including civil liberties during the Civil War, the USS Monitor and the Battle of Hampton Roads, the presidential election of 1864, and what Abraham Lincoln and soldiers dreamt about. His most recent publications include Shipwrecked, a true Civil War story of mutinies, jailbreaks, blockade running, and the slave trade, and also a children's book, My Day with Abe Lincoln. I will ask the first in a series of questions about your collection, Final Resting Places, which explored graves relating to the Civil War. So can you both speak a little bit about how you came up with the idea for this collection? What made you decide graves would be a good idea?
Yeah, so I'll start. I grew up as a kid, I know this is really weird for people outside of the history world, but I grew up really enjoying going to grave sites and cemeteries. And, I remember when I was younger going to Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and seeing Harriet Jacobs and being like, oh, I know her. And that's one of the fun things about going to different grave sites, seeing people you know and seeing their final resting places. And so I had the idea for a volume like this years ago, but I never acted on it. And then Brian and I got together at the Society of Civil War Historians conference in Pittsburgh. I think it was 2018. And we got breakfast before our sessions one day, and we were just talking and having a good time. And I told him about this idea, and he just looked at me and said something like, "Let's do it." And so we grabbed a napkin and a pen and just started sketching out names and concepts and themes. And then for the rest of the conference, we went around asking people, hey, would you want to contribute to this? And we were able to put together just a stellar cast of contributors.
Yeah, and I'll add too that of course, the Civil War did nothing better or more effectively than create grave sites and a stunning diversity of grave sites, right? From makeshift burial trenches on the battlefields to our first national cemeteries, from unknown graves to watery graves like the turret of the Monitor. And it's amazing in all of the literature on the Civil War that there was no one volume that had ever kind of surveyed the gravesite as a site of memory, as a contested terrain where the meaning and legacy of the Civil War had been worked out by many generations. And so, kind of taking inspiration from recent books by Gary Gallagher and Matt Gallman, Lens of War, that looked at photographs and Civil War places that had looked really at battlefields and historic sites. We thought this is an awesome opportunity to reflect on places that have been personally meaningful to us, but then think about the these sites as places of memory.
And Brian makes a great point that I'll just touch on, and that is we didn't want 20 headstones or 30 headstones. So as we thought about who to invite, who's worked on different things, we wanted to come up with concepts so that they would be a diverse array of final resting places. And ultimately we didn't know, we gave people a lot of free rein to pick, but we also selected writers that we knew would probably be able to talk about different types of places.
So one of the core features of the collection is that most of the essays, maybe all of the essays, weave in autobiography. Could you talk a little bit more about that decision and why you chose to go that route?
Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. We invited all of the contributors when we first solicited these essays to embraced the tool of autobiography to the extent to which they were comfortable. So some of the pieces are, really autobiographical. Others are, were less comfortable inserting themselves into the essays. But we felt that was important, not only because of what grave sites and cemeteries and boneyards have meant to us in our journeys as historians, and certainly as a young boy, kind of similar to John, I was visiting grave sites in northeastern Ohio. It was kind of the first place where I too could connect with the war and kind of individually, research soldiers who were buried in my hometown and kind of think about the impact of the war, and how the battlefield events spread into many different communities and left their mark. So we understood the emotive power of these places, and that emotional power often shapes the work that we do as historians. And we wanted to kind of pull back the curtain on that process and really invite readers and the lay public into the emotional connections that we make with our subjects, and to think about our work really as a part of the grieving process, right? I mean, what we do, the words that we put on the page, the stories that we tell, the people that we want to remember. I mean, our work is not unlike a headstone or a tombstone in a cemetery, right? In trying to keep alive the memories of those words and deeds and peoples of the past.
Yeah, and I love that way Brian put it about sort of pulling back the curtain so that the readers can really see what makes the historian tick. And some of the essays are just so moving. Glenn LaFantasy's is the opening essay in the book. And I remember sitting right here in this chair at this desk the day after one of the school shootings a few years ago, reading his essay. And the story he tells is about how a Confederate officer tries to, spends decades trying to figure out where his brother has been buried. And it's a 40-year journey. And at the end of that essay, Glenn works his own story into it and how he's been a biographer of this officer, and his wife has been part of his research story and his life as a historian. And at the very end, Glenn reveals that in the process, in the time of writing this essay, his wife has passed. And I remember sitting in my office here going through the page proofs, and page proofs is usually a pretty bland, tedious thing where you're just looking for typos. And I just sat here, right here, and started to cry at my seat. And maybe I shouldn't admit that, I don't know. But I was just so moved in that moment of thinking about the families who'd been affected by the shooting, and thinking about Glenn's family, and thinking about Colonel Oates's family, and how these emotions and these experiences are human, and they reach out across time. And this sort of autobiographical approach, I think, really brings this experience of death to life for readers.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that experience of reading it, where you're, relating to the past in a different way, and to the people of the past, as you said, like in a way that feels very not current, but feels very relatable, and certainly you can understand them. So this is a good segue actually, because so you use the graves are obviously the framing device, and there's some really, I mean, as you said, they're very varied, and some very colorful stories. Like the John Wilkes Booth journey, I think is really kind of mesmerizing. But these essays are mostly and profoundly about grief. So, and you've touched on this a little bit, but what do you want readers to take with them from this collection, either as scholars or just as people?
Brian, why don't you start us off if you want?
Sure. I think that grief, sort of like the war itself, the injuries of the war, the wounds of the war, it's not linear, right? It takes a serpentine journey through time, across space. Um, the grief of the Civil War, right? It reaches well beyond the battlefields to every, community. And that's one thing that we wanted to illustrate, right? From things like the Shohala gravesite up in northeastern Pennsylvania to the Confederate boneyard in Sao Paulo, Brazil, right? That there are places where the cost, the human consequences of the Civil War can still be felt. And I think, again, as historians, we're personally invested in those cycles of grief, right? We live in the archives. We come to know our subjects sometimes as well as we know our living relatives, and we feel a sense of connection and a duty to them to tell their stories as honestly and as truthfully as we can. And there's something spiritual, right, about that. And that process is never finished, right? And the grieving process is never finished. Even some of the grave sites, right, are never finished, right? We chronicle in this book a number of relocations and rediscoveries, removals, right? Elizabeth Keckley's gravesite comes to mind. The monument for A.P. Hill. It's a story that we wanted to include, but of course, in recent times, that's been moved. Nathan Bedford Forest as well. So, you know, we think about, there's sort of an irony to the title, Final Resting Places. They're actually not, right? The meaning that we assign to these graves and even their locations, right, has changed over time, and the way that we intersect with them as people and as historians changes over time.
Yeah, when I teach my Intro to American Studies course at Christopher Newport, one of the big themes that I try to get them to see is the importance of memory and of sacrifice. And so we read Lincoln's Lyceum address from 1838, where he talks about the importance of remembering the sacrifices of generations that have gone before them. And then we read Lincoln's first inaugural, where he talks about the memory of every patriot grave, battlefield and patriot grave and living heart and hearthstone. And then the Gettysburg Address, where we got our title from. Like, these themes were central to Lincoln's thinking, that it's important to remember the sacrifices of those who come before you. And so in my class, that touches on all sorts of different things. The women who hunger struck during World War One, and if you don't vote, you're trampling on that sacrifice that they fought, or the African Americans who, went through great turmoil to be able to go to integrated schools in the 50s and 60s. And I think that those lessons are evident here too, in almost all of the essays. I think there's a few, Michael Vorenberg's would be an exception, but in a lot of these essays, I think it brings to life the sacrifices that earlier generations went through in order to give us a more perfect union. And so Barb Gannon's essay is a beautiful essay that talks about this integrated GAR cemetery that's in Elgin, Illinois, I think, and it's not well known, but it's a beautiful picture of the sacrifices of the generation that came before us. And so I hope readers will come away with a deeper appreciation of, as Brian said, the cost of the war, the sacrifice that it was.
So, as you guys have both pointed out, there are a lot of essays in this book, a lot of contributors. And it's, not it is a very different sort of kind of collection because it is so there's so much first person and so much biography. Um, so what were some of the rewards and then of course the challenges of putting together this collection?
The challenge of any edited collection like this is that it's like herding cats. And so we had 28 contributors plus a forward. And in the process, we had some people drop out, and we invited probably five or more people who took some time to think about it and turned us down. And then once you even have your slate of contributors, getting everyone to get their essay in on time and then make revisions in a timely way can be challenging sometimes. But at the same time, and every time I do one of these, I say I'm never going to do it again, because it's such a job to try to just get all the pieces in place. And yet it's so rewarding when you get the book in place. I mean, the beauty of a book like this is that Brian and I could not have written it. You need all these different voices to bring it together. And so you get the right group of people who are able to bring each a different perspective, and I think it turns into a really beautiful book. And along those lines too, I mean, I have to give really great credit to University of Georgia Press. I mean, they did an extraordinary job putting the book together. The images are full color. I think we've got 130 or so images. I mean, the fact that they were willing to do that was really gratifying because if you put your heart and soul into a book, and then if the production quality isn't nice, you look at it and you're like, well, I'm glad I did this, but it's not that fulfilling. But when you have a book like this, that they really did a beautiful job on, it makes it all the more gratifying.
And I'll just add, I mean, to the other great challenge of this book, of course, was what to exclude, right? There's
Hmm.
so many possibilities of what we could have included here. An essay on Stonewall Jackson's arm, which has its
Yeah.
own grave marker at Elwood on the Wilderness Battlefield. The Tomb of the Civil War Unknowns, Lincoln's grave. I mean, so many different opportunities and just limited space. But of course, as I'll echo John here, both it was a pleasure to work with UGA Press. They produced a beautiful book, but just the contributors here. I mean, we had the opportunity to work with some of the best in our field. They really wrote essays that they were willing to make themselves vulnerable on the page, and it's just an incredibly moving book from start to finish, and to juxtapose their work and to think about the connections between. It's really, really a stunning piece of work, and it's owes everything to the stellar cast of contributors.
I was at the Lincoln Forum this weekend in Gettysburg, and last year I did a panel on this book, and so we had a number of the contributors there, and then this year a number of the contributors were still there, and during the book signing, people were going around with it just as they did last year, having the contributors sign their chapters. And I think that's a testament to just how beautifully and powerfully written each of the chapters is.
I'm glad that you brought up in your answers UGA Press because it truly like the content and the writing is beautiful and moving, but it truly really just is a beautiful book. The production quality is I was impressed. And the color and all of the images really adds to the experience. It's a nice project. So we have just a couple minutes of time left. Just a question I was thinking of as we were talking, if you guys are willing to answer it.
Sure.
So we do have often we have students who watch these videos. They're in a history class perhaps. Um, what would you tell students, either high school or undergraduate, um, how would you have them think about cemeteries, maybe in their local community or in their hometowns or something of that sort?
You know, it's interesting. Brian mentioned earlier about how the Civil War is the beginning of the National Cemetery movement. And prior to that, in this country, you have the rural cemetery movement, which was the concept that Mark Shantz has written so much about is that these would be places and communities and cities that would be sort of an oasis away from the hustle and bustle of the city. It would be a place where young people could go and sort of have this liminal space between living and dead, but also where you could become a better citizen because you would care for this place and you would learn about your past of your community or your family. I mean, that sort of experience is one of the things that inspired me as a kid to want to become a historian. And the thing is, a lot of these cemeteries are neglected today, or if not just entirely neglected and abandoned, are just not visited very often. And I would encourage young people who read this book to not be afraid of the thought of maybe go, it might feel weird the first time you do it, but to go to a cemetery and just walk around and see the inscriptions on the stones, or, if they have a little building where you can learn more about the people who are, a lot of national cemeteries have that, where you can learn more about the people who are buried there. It's amazing the local history that you can learn, the history about your community that might inspire you to learn more or to do something in your community, maybe to raise civic awareness. And I think cemeteries in the 1830s and 40s were envisioned that way. And I think we've kind of lost sight of that as Americans, but I don't think it'd be the worst possible thing for us to recapture an aspect of that history.
Yeah, I would echo all of that, and I would say, um, we have courses here at Sam Houston State University where all about academic community engagement, and part of that is going out into some of these neglected cemeteries and recovering stories of members of the community here in Huntsville, Texas, right? We have United States Color Troops who are buried here. Their stories are not told locally until we get students on the ground to do the research and to do the writing. And there are other projects too. I'm thinking of Barbara Gannon at the University of Central Florida, who has her Veterans History Project, and they go through and write biographies of veterans in the national cemeteries. And it's just an incredible way to kind of incrementally take a local micro historical approach to the past that, you know, um, a great opportunity for undergraduate research.
Yeah, Matt Pinksker has done a similar thing at Dickinson, and he's had some of his students make videos about these places in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And my recollection is that there was a black cemetery with USCT veterans in Carlisle that was either paved over or turned into a park. I'm a little fuzzy on it now, but he had his students go to the local library and historical society and begin to dig up the past and who were these men who, again, had sacrificed for their country and whose graves were now completely lost.
Thank you both so much. This has been a really interesting conversation. It's always a pleasure to chat with historians, kind of hear the story behind the book and the collection that we enjoy reading. Um, uh, any other thoughts, things you want to share, thoughts you have about the book?
Well, I'll just say thank you for the work you're doing as the book reviews editor with the journal and for doing programs like this to help us be able to talk more about the project. I think it's great.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Megan. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you both so much.